Now this is a good point at which to ask Klassen here, who will tell you about himself in a minute, to do what he wants to do, and then maybe we'll have an opportunity for a bit of discussion back on that. My dear chap, we're in your hands.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm Marco Klassen. I'm not English, as you may be able to tell. I'm here on a year exchange from Canada. I've got a background in art history and literature and study of comics and graphic novels. And I've spent a lot of time encountering religion through art. And so I'm in this course in the hope that I would encounter art through religion. And it's happened. So I'm going to turn that off and that on. So I'm, both studying comics and making comics. Cartoonist is the profession which I guess I've sacralized as my identity. And as a cartoonist, censorship has a way of really pissing me off. I don't like people telling me that things that I've made can't be shown to the people I made them for. That said, I'm going to choose to censor this entire part of the lecture. There we go. I wanted to show you a whole bunch of images of Muhammad as part of this. And I'm not going to show you any images of Muhammad. And hopefully that will carry equal weight as the other choice will. As Professor Davies said, there's a rich tradition of painting depicting the Prophet, starting about 13th century, primarily in Persia. And none of it offensive imagery, all sacred imagery, very respectful imagery. So in the sort of spirit of fundamentalist censorship, I'm not going to show you either respectful imagery or offensive imagery. And on the topic of fundamentalism, we will start with these guys. So South Park introduced Muhammad as a member of their cast in 2001. As part of the Super Best Friends, as you can clearly see here, left to right, Buddha, Krishna, Muhammad, Jesus, Seaman, Lao Zai, and our friend Joseph Smith. And Moses, who appears as a giant glowing dreidel. Because South Park. So in 2005, late 2005, early 2006, you had the whole Danish cartoon controversy. The Danish newspaper Jyllands-Posten published this collection of Muhammad cartoons. And South Park responded to that with a two-part story arc called Cartoon Wars, in which a cartoon that the cartoon characters are watching, namely Family Guy, says that they are going to air an episode featuring an uncensored image of Muhammad, and everybody freaks out. The entirety of America responds by literally burying their heads in the sand. And two of the characters, for those of you who watch the show, Kyle and Cartman, decide that they're going to prevent tragedy and death, going to travel to Los Angeles and convince the executives of Fox to blank out Muhammad. And in the course of that journey, it comes to light that Cartman's intentions were less than pure. And Kyle, it becomes a battle between the characters. Cartman wants Muhammad censored. Kyle is fighting in favor of free speech. The sort of denouement of the whole story is the revelation that the Family Guy writing team are, in fact, 5 manatees in a tank of water. Because the entire show also spends its time taking the piss out of the writing on Family Guy. The right side of the tank is filled with balls that have words written on them, verbs and nouns and adjectives. And the manatees swim back and forth carrying these in whatever order they please to a hole in the wall, which drops it into a machine, which organizes it into a combination of words that gives the show a joke. On discovering this, the characters say, like, how on earth did you end up with a joke about Muhammad through this ridiculous system? And the answer they're given is that, well, because the Muhammad ball was in the tank. And if we take any one of the balls out of the tank, the manatees stop working for us. They're very strict about that. Either everything is on the table or nothing is on the table. So the episode ends with free speech victorious. They convince the president to show show Muhammad, and presumably the Family Guy episode airs with Muhammad uncensored. The South Park episode airs like this, because Comedy Central in our world would not allow an image of Muhammad to air on their network. 2005, very interesting year for Islam and comics. This superhero team, the 99, was published in late 2005, desperately trying to get press, trying to get its name out there. Didn't happen until the Danish cartoon thing happened, and suddenly everybody Googling Islam and cartoon got these guys. So written, created and written by this lovely gentleman, Dr. Naif al-Matawa. Alright, so as sort of a shameless plug now, last summer, June 2014, the organization that I work with, Sacred and Sequential, we're a group of international comics scholars focused on sort of the intersection between comics and religion. We got pulled into a thing that happened online, which was that ISIS issued a fatwa calling for the death of Dr. Naif al-Matawa. They said, your comic book series, which presents the 99 aspects of Allah listed in the Quran and embodies them as superpowers through teenagers from 99 different countries around the world, is blasphemous, and we want you dead. So they issued this statement over Twitter, which was appropriate, I suppose, in today's media culture. Our group got together online, said, well, we're fairly new. We were only about a year old at that time. Said, well, we're supposed to be the comics and religion people, so let's get vocal. And we did, and it was an interesting thing to be retweeted by somebody that ISIS wants assassinated. I suppose I felt fairly secure all the way over in Canada and kind of out of the reach of ISIS, but nonetheless connected to this. So Dr. al-Matawa's response was great, because in his stories, these superpowers are given these kids. The story originates in 1258 in the Mongol sack of Baghdad, and the librarian's trying to save the contents of the library through a series of alchemical processes, take all of that knowledge and distill it into 99 gemstones called the Noor Stones, Noor being Arabic for light. These 99 stones in 1492, Granada falls, the last Muslim enclave in Spain, falls. 33 of these stones cross the Atlantic Ocean with Columbus. 33 of these stones go east with Marco Polo. And 33 of these stones get sort of scattered through Europe. And it's 2010 now. This knowledge has ended up embodied in these 99 teenagers who represent the various aspects of Allah: generosity, mercy, but also things like Allah is the hidden or Allah is the destroyer. And they have to learn how to use their powers. They try to initially use them for self-gain, and that always backfires on them. So they start using them to serve others. And the stones are constantly updating. They're not just giving them the knowledge that was available in 1258, but they're constantly feeding these people a sort of inherent stream of the collective knowledge of villains in these stories are people who can't control the stones. Even if they got a hold of them, they couldn't control their power. But they're out to stop them from updating. They're out to freeze the knowledge, as it were. So Dr. Omatawa's response was, first, well, I'm going to take legal action against whoever's running these Twitter accounts. And secondly, the villains of my books just stepped off the page and put a gun to my head. That validates everything I've been doing since 2005. And it was a particularly, those of you who were tuned into the media in summer 2014, it was a particularly powerful thing to happen in the context of everything that Malala Yousafzai was saying about education in the Middle East and sort of the suppression of knowledge. So, switching tacks here. Why are comics and cartooning such a powerful medium? Why has this come up as the ultimate danger? What makes them so effective? The American Jewish cartoonist Art Spiegelman, some of you may have known Mouse, very knowledgeable fellow with great respect for satire. So he's been approached by the media a lot in the last month regarding the sort of fallout from the shootings in Paris, the Charlie Hebdo tragedy. And Spiegelman always touts comics as a distilled medium, that it has this immediacy that you don't get from anything else. If you, depending on how much value you give to the currency of cliche, that this image will hit you way faster than the 1,000 words that it takes to describe it. And with cartooning, you're stripping down, you're not eliminating, as Scott McCloud is saying here, you're not eliminating details, you're focusing on the fundamental details. Which means that what we're seeing with things like Charlie Hebdo is we're seeing fundamentalist censorship of a fundamentalist art. And abstraction is, I think, a key thing here. That this collection of a circle and a curved line and two dots or two circles, we recognize that as a face. We recognize that as a abstracted representation of the people that we interact with on a daily basis. Two eyes and a mouth, missing a nose, missing hair and ears, but whatever, it's a face. But we also recognize this as face. Now, it doesn't look anything like the people that we interact with on a regular basis. There are no eyes in that collection of symbols. So McCloud proposes that one of these is perceived. The image on the left is perceived information. We perceive it as being the same as what we're seeing around us. The other one is received information. You can only receive information if you're, in radio terms, if you're tuned into the right frequency. You have to learn it. You can't recognize that word until you know each of the symbols that are the letters represent a certain sound in a certain, we construct a semantic unit that we call a word out of them. It means something, but it doesn't look like the thing that it means. And we spend our entire life building these meanings, attaching these symbols to concepts. So faces and clouds and the moon. And there's always a symbol that may or may not look like the thing that it represents, and there's the concept. So there's a signifier and a signifier for those of you who are familiar with semiotics. So I'm not allowed to show you a picture of Muhammad. I'm not allowed to show you a cartoon of Muhammad, an abstract, figurative, visual representation of the Prophet, but I can do this. Now, why? None of us has ever seen Muhammad. There's no photographic representation of Muhammad. Nobody no portrait artist sat down with him and made an accurate historical record of this is what this dude looks like. Now let's stick to it whenever we're making an image of him. The closest we have is the 13th century, 600 years after he was actually alive. So the closest we have is already a distant abstraction of the Prophet. And that image has evolved drastically in, 700 years. So when we're looking at a cartoon of the Prophet, we're looking at the very best, an abstraction of an entire genealogy of abstractions. When you look at this word, you're also looking at an abstraction and you know exactly what it means. You know exactly what it refers to. Earlier this week in Palestine, a cartoonist was arrested for supposedly publishing a cartoon of the Prophet. What he says he drew, which was an image of a Muslim figure, monumental Muslim figure, standing on top of a globe, the Earth, floating in space, and scattering sparks of light into space out of a heart-shaped purse. And he says he wanted to represent the Muslim people as spreading enlightenment into the darkness from a source of love. And the authorities in Palestine said, no, you drew the Prophet and you're going to jail. So pictures of the Prophet or pictures of Muslims can be so ambiguous that we mistake them for something else. In this case, a picture of a generic Muslim can be mistaken for the Prophet. But you would never mistake this for me talking about a generic Muslim. So why is it that we're banning the ambiguous and not the specific? We're dealing with a web, a network of confused reference within these symbols. We're at a point now where a picture of Muhammad can represent Muslims, or it can represent the idea of Islam. But a picture of a generic Muslim might also represent the Prophet, or it might represent the idea of Islam. But we also say things like, Islam says this. Well, Islam isn't alive. It doesn't have vocal cords. It doesn't say anything. So when we say Islam, are we referring to the tenets of the Prophet? Are we referring to the words of Muhammad? Or are we referring to the believers? Everything's confused. Everything refers to everything else at this point. Which is why I drew that when I was in France right after the shootings happened. Because there was this idea that representation is not it's not just a one-way street. It's not, there's no direct connection. So we don't really have issues of images of Christ at least in Western culture, in modern Western culture. As you said, the early Christian church, that was an issue, but less so these days. And less so through, the Renaissance. There's a lot of incredible art that prominently features Christ. And the idea of being a living representation of Christ is not alien to Christianity. It's fundamental to Christianity that you, as a believer, represent Christ. And Christ is an abstraction in himself. But he's also a paradox, because he's a fleshly representation of the concept of God, the higher being of God. But he's fully God and he's fully human. He's the abstract and the concept in the same signifier. Which makes him an interesting guy. Maybe that's why, as a Christian, I don't get offended when I see that. If you want to offend a Muslim, dress their holy figure in red and blue spandex and tell them he's an American. But it's natural for Christianity to see their ideals embodied and visualized and symbolized. I don't remember where I was going from here. So as we've said, we're meaning-making animals. The first thing that we did when the human animal could recognize itself as a culture, apart from the other, everything other than us, the first thing we did was draw. The first thing we did was make pictures of ourselves in relation to the world around us, and not just the animals and us, but the hunt, the power dynamic between us, and our holy figures, the symbols of our faith, the figures of our faith, the bird-headed guy lying in front of a bison, a sacrificial animal that's had its guts torn out. Those are the first things that we drew as meaning-making animals, and then we proceeded to this. And we proceeded to this, probably the same artist too. He finished one wall. He was like, well, I better do the other wall. What do I do with the ceiling? it's too early for that one. I don't know how many of you saw the film Lucy that came out last year. Anybody? Anybody? Okay. All right movie. It was a kind of artsy, kind of a character piece, bit of action. Stars ScarJo. It's good. But it had this really interesting idea, which was that humans were just overly elaborate cells existing in a system of life, and that our drive, our function as cells, is to do what every other cell does in a system of life, which is to accumulate knowledge of what existence is going to entail and pass it on. This cellular function of legacy is what we're driven to, and religion is a huge part of that, because it's the structuring of what we believe existence means, what it is to be a cell in a system of life, where the system of life came from. And censorship is asking us to erase ourselves from that legacy, to not just don't leave anything behind, but don't let anybody else that thinks like you leave anything behind, because that would ruin the story. And so there's this fundamentalist corner of Islam that's saying, well, nobody should be making any images of the Prophet. We don't want anybody else's thoughts on Muhammad being left behind for somebody else. That chapter is ours to write. Nobody else gets a part in that narrative. And essentially what they're going to be left with is a book where the character of Islam sits in a dark, empty room and doesn't interact with any of the other characters, which makes for great plot development. You're not going to have any discourse. You're not going to have any conflict. You're not going to have any. It's going to be pretty stale by the end of it all. And your visual survey of the great religions of the world is going to end up looking something like that. So, is this cartoon more or less offensive than it would have been if I'd included Muhammad among the holy figures of the world? If somebody like, Charlie Hebdo in Paris is going to satirize the powers that be, as it were, do you want your figure included or left out of that discourse? Is it more offensive to be sort of brushed off to the side and said, well, they don't want to be part of this, let's leave them out? I guess. Oh no, there was something else that I wanted to talk about quickly, which was that. Go back to McCloud for a second here. On the topic of identity, quickly, the portrait on the far left of this image is a very specific person. It represents a singularity of identity. That is one individual. The image on the far right could be any one of you. That abstraction allows a spectrum rather than a singularity of identity, which is another reason why cartoons are so incredibly effective, because it leaves space within the image for us to project ourselves into it. So when we talk about believers beginning to identify themselves by the symbols of their faith, those symbols are essentially abstractions that have been left open for projection. And when you draw a cartoon of Muhammad, it's open enough that every Muslim can see themselves in that image. And that's why you get people with guns running around, because the offense moves from the sort of esoteric, I'm insulting your concept, to I'm insulting you and the way that you have structured your